And we all want to hear what Alan has to say. So we are so honored to have Alan Weisman here with us today at UVM. He has requested a brief introduction, so I will try to be brief. Alan is an acclaimed journalist with a deep passion and concern for our planet and the people on it. He has written 6 books, you can see them up here, and many, many, many articles. So look for him out there. He has also won many awards, which I will not name because it's a really long list. It's really impressive, trust me. And he's won so many awards because his incisive and thoughtful writing is filled with deep research, memorable and artful images. I could name some, but I will hold myself back. They're in my head. And impressive syntheses. He really is a genius at illuminating and explaining the many complex aspects of social ecological issues, which are things that we all think about a lot. Alan is one of the most accomplished people in the world at bringing social and environmental concerns to the attention of a broad swath of humanity. His work has deeply impacted definitely tens of thousands, probably tens of millions, quite likely hundreds of millions of people. And Alan has spent time with fascinating people all across the globe. He's probably had more insightful conversations and asked more and better questions than anyone I can think of. So I, for one, cannot wait to hear what this wise member of our society will be sharing with us today. So please join me in welcoming Alan Weisman.
Thank you, Rochelle. I am just a journalist. Any wisdom that I have is what I get from the people that I interview. When I was doing my last book, Countdown, I spent a lot of time at Stanford University where Professor Rochelle Gould was at the time a graduate student, and she and her colleagues, without them, there would be no book Countdown. So I'm very grateful to her and to all the people who inform my writings, and I'm really grateful to the University of Vermont for inviting me today. So, as a journalist, as I taught in a class today, you become a journalist because you're interested in everything. You can't make up your mind what to do with your life, and you just sort of want to insert yourself into all of it. And I've had the great fortune to do that. But over the past couple of decades, more and more I've been writing about the environment, because the environment is the story beneath all the story. You take away the environment and we don't have anything else. We don't have politics, we don't have economics. And my work as an environmental journalist has taken me to some of the most beautiful places on Earth, and also to some of the most frightening places on Earth, and sometimes they're the same places, like Antarctica with a hole in the sky over it, or the Amazon rainforest, except the parts of it that were being torn down or being burned, to the beautiful frozen Arctic to watch it melt away, to my father's homeland, rural Ukraine, with incredibly fertile soils, which had been contaminated by the Chernobyl disaster. And after a while, I realized that these were not just isolated events. They were all connected, and the connection was what my species was doing on this planet. And that connected together, they added up to a global environmental crisis. Having had the privilege to see so much of it, I decided that I should write about that subject, these connections. But it's complicated and it's global, so it needed a book. And as I explained to some students today, the problem with an environmental book is that oftentimes they're only read by people who are already interested in the environment, who already know that stuff, because people find them so depressing or so scary. So I thought for a few years about, how could I do justice to this book, and yet as a journalist, not just preach to the choir, but reach the widest possible audience. And then an editor, in a chance comment, asked me an interesting question, which was, what would happen to this planet if everybody just disappeared? And she didn't mean like, you know, what'll happen when we eat ourselves out of house and planet and there's nothing left and then we just go down with all the other species that we've extinguished. But what would happen if we just went poof? And not being a science fiction writer, I first of all didn't think that was an appropriate topic, but then I realized that it's remotely possible that it could happen. A Homo sapiens specific virus could pick us all off and leave everything else intact. You know, say AIDS went airborne and we all got it. And then I started to realize, well, if everybody's concerned about environmental books, the reason why they don't want to kick back in their leisure time and read them is that who wants to read about something that says we might all die if things don't change? If I killed everybody off right in the beginning, we wouldn't have to worry about that anymore. But since we're all suckers for the future, you get to hang around and see what happens next. And that became my book, The World Without Us. And fortunately, that little trick that I played by wiping everybody off in one paragraph very quick, soon in the beginning of the book, and then letting people see how nature behaves when it's relieved with all the pressures that we heap on it daily. And also, what happens to all the stuff that we've built? How long will it last without our constant maintenance? That experiment worked. I am grateful to say that this book became an international bestseller. It's about to be published in its 35th language. It was really fascinating to research. I mean, I learned amazing things, starting with, you know, how quickly does a house deteriorate and finally get overrun by nature and just plain collapse if we're not constantly maintaining it. Every homeowner in this room understands that one perfectly. And then expanded to cities. I spent time in New York, one of the most familiar cities on earth. Everybody's either been there or seen it in a movie, where I learned as subway engineers crawled me under the tunnels in Manhattan to show me how many pumps they have to keep operating constantly, over 800, because Manhattan used to be full of rivers, and when we superimposed flat streets and a grid on top of it, we pushed those rivers underground. When you don't have power, if humans disappear and those subway tunnels fill, pretty soon all those columns that hold up the ceiling, which is really the street, you know, those will collapse, and then there'll be rivers on Manhattan again, and birds will fly over and drop something in them, and pretty soon there'll be frogs and there'll be fish. As one, I mentioned this example earlier today, as one guy who was in charge of several of the bridges that connects Manhattan to the rest of the mainland and the other boroughs told me, he said, you would not believe how often you turn around and some bird has flown over the Verrazano-Narrows Bridge or the George Washington Bridge and has pooped out a seed, and that seed will get lodged between the intersection of steel plates. These are 2-inch thick plates, but now this seed, which is coated with fertilizer, germinates, and the next thing you know, there's this ailanthus tree that is pushing apart the George Washington Bridge. And they're constantly, he told me, he says, we are in a constant battle against nature that we will ultimately lose, but hopefully not on my watch. I learned how our petroleum infrastructure, all those tanks and those pipelines, et cetera, will one day corrode and crumble, of course, with a few explosions helping them along when we're not there to man them, and also our nuke plants, unfortunately, with bigger explosions. How all that plastic that's now finding its way to the ocean will eventually get eaten as microbes evolve the enzymes to digest it, just like it took them a long time to figure out how to digest lignin, which is why we still have petrified wood around. There was nothing to decay it. Although, it may take 100,000 years before nature evolves to do that. But, nature's got all the time in the world. One thing that I learned from doing that book is that life is incredibly resilient. I mean, it's incredibly powerful. The Korean demilitarized zone is another place that I went. And, you know, this is one of the most deadly places on Earth, with two of the world's most hostile armies facing off each other, against each other. And just down the middle in this no man's land, which used to be rice paddies and villages, nature has come back so forcefully that it is now one of the most important wildlife refuges in all of Asia and home to all these endangered species. You know, I started doing that book because I was worried about the planet, but I am no longer worried about the planet. The planet is going to be fine. It has gone through all of these extinctions in the past, and each time it bounces back more beautifully. I mean, the granddaddy of them all was the Permian extinction 252 million years ago. An incredible volcanic explosion in what today is Siberia came up right through the Carboniferous layer, so talk about global warming. And in the middle of all that, an asteroid hit what is today Antarctica. And at the end of that, 90-some% of all species were gone. You know, the only vertebrate left was this little toothed worm, our ancestor. And, you know, some weeds that eventually decayed and dropped some material that built up soil again, and it took hundreds of millions of years, but then the place was just gorgeous again, this jungle with these enormous reptiles that reigned for 125 million years until this other asteroid shows up and left this big empty niche that a rather minor character in the Age of Dinosaurs then leaped into, called mammals. And here we are. But, you know, what about us? The title of that book, The World Without Us, is basically, it's a red herring. I didn't write it because I want a world without us. What I wanted people to do was see how beautifully nature can recover and heal even some of our worst wounds, like at Chernobyl, given the opportunity. And then I hope ask themselves, wow, isn't there some way that we can add ourselves back to that picture? Only in harmony rather than mortal combat with the rest of nature. And that's what I planned on writing about in the epilogue, some ways that we could do that. But just as I was starting the epilogue, I did one last interview and I got slammed by a statistic. Now, I try not to use a lot of statistics, and this one was even hard to interpret. The statistic was that every year we add 85 million people to the planet, which, like, big planet, what is 85 million? But when you divide that by 365, you realize about every 4 days or so we're adding 1 million more people. That's births minus deaths. So that just did not seem like a sustainable figure to me. So this was completely unplanned. In the last 2 weeks before I delivered that manuscript, I scrambled around and I did something else. It was another thought experiment, but instead of what would the world be like without people, I contacted one of the most distinguished demographic institutes on Earth, and I asked them, what would happen, setting aside all the social considerations for the moment, what would happen if the entire world participated in China's one-child policy? And no one had ever asked them that. And a week later, they sent me back this graph, and they showed that we'd level off fairly soon, but then as people died off by the middle of the century, suddenly our population would drop dramatically, and by the end of this century, we would be down to a little over 1.5 billion people. Now, that's an interesting figure. That would give us a lot of room. That would give other species a lot of room. But the problem is that nobody likes the Chinese one-child policy. The Chinese didn't like it. Even though Chinese ecologists have explained to me that if it hadn't been for the one-child policy today, there would be 400 million more Chinese. Still, the thought of someone telling us what to do in our bedrooms like that, that just is very repellent. I mean, like any other species, we're designed to make copies of ourselves. And so, nevertheless, that question I left hanging at the end of The World Without Us, should we do something about that, turned out to be the question that most people wanted to talk to me about. Because everybody, I mean, even right-wing radio hosts were saying this to me, that's an awful idea, but still, yeah, I mean, we just can't keep growing on a planet that doesn't grow. What are we going to do? Is there something that we can do that's more humane than that? And I heard it so often that finally I heard what they were asking me, and I decided, well, maybe I should look at it. And that became my book, Countdown. But, it's a loaded question. It physically makes us, viscerally makes us uncomfortable to limit ourselves. And then religions. Every religion on earth starts with the edict of be fruitful and multiply. Why? Well, in the Bible, our Judeo-Christian patriarchs were polygamists for the same reason the Mormons were and the same reason the Muslims have been. It's a way to increase your population very fast and be stronger than your neighbors who might outcompete you. Though, as I mentioned to a class today, it is interesting that in the Bible, after you get through those first 3 generations, you get to the 4th generation. Jacob had 13 kids. And one of them, Joseph, I think of as the first ecologist in our recorded literature, because he was very observant and he realized that the earth was entering a period of scarcity. So he only had 1 wife and only 2 children, and he counseled the Pharaoh of Egypt and the Israelites that now was not a time to keep expanding. It was a time to conserve. But still, I don't have to tell you how religions still feel about this. Economists love big populations. They always talk about, what's the mantra of, growth. That's what makes a healthy economy. And the reason they love populations is twofold. One is they want a lot of consumers for products. But the other one, which is the one that they don't like to admit, is that the more people there are, the cheaper labor is, because you can have a lot of poor people, miserable people fighting each other over awful salaries. So we hear them preaching constant growth, which you can't have without population growth. To do this book, I needed to research it dispassionately and objectively. There are also, there are great arguments in the feminist community of, who's taking control of female bodies, and these are important arguments. So ultimately, to write Countdown, I boiled it down to 4 questions. Number 1, how many people can the Earth hold without collapsing, without sinking? Second, the converse of that, how much nature do we have to preserve in order to ensure our own survival? Can we even know which species are essential to us? Or is it not until we pushed one too many off the planet and, oops, we should have saved that one, too late. Number 3, if China's policy is unacceptable, is there an alternative out there? And is there anything in the histories, the liturgies of all the world's myriad cultures and nations and tribes that might accept the idea of refraining from embracing so much, if it's the season to do that? And in order to answer that question, I ended up going to 21 countries. I began in Israel and Palestine, and I ended in Iran. I'll get back to both of those places in a bit. And number 4, if in order to be a healthy, sustainable planet, we must bring our population down, is there a way to design an economy that can prosper without constant growth? Well, in two different places in the world, two different experts said to me the same thing. They said, you're asking the most important questions on the planet, and they may be impossible to answer. And my response to them was, hey, you know, I'm just a journalist. I'm not an expert, but if someone tells a journalist that these are the most important questions on the planet, you know, we damn well better try. And, you know, so I did. Now, if these are the most important questions, why do most of us never think of population as the problem that underlies all others? Now, one of them I already hinted at. You know, it's cultural. I started this book in Israel and Palestine because it evokes such high emotions in most of the world's people, and also because it's a textbook example of, frankly, how bad things can get. Israel and Palestine are two peoples occupying this one country, half of which or more is a sandbox, and they're locked in a demolition derby. They've been trying to outpopulate each other to be the majority in that country. Now, before Israel became a state, it was under British mandate. British ecologists calculated the carrying capacity of what we call the Holy Land to be 2.5 million people. David Ben-Gurion, the Zionist who was the founding father of the state of Israel, insisted that Jewish ingenuity could make the desert bloom and that he was sure that they could fit a lot more in there. He said, we can get up to 6 million people here, more than twice as much. Well, today there's nearly 13 million between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, and if they keep going the way they're going right now, there'll be about 21 million by mid-century and a whole lot less water. You know, no one thinks of that conflict over there in terms of environmental pressure. But that's what it's all about. That's what it's been about since biblical times. You wonder why Israel won't give up those settlements on the West Bank? That's where the aquifer lies. So, but the main reason, far more than religion, why we don't think about overpopulation involves a trick of perception, and that's because we all pretty much think of the world that we were born into as the normal world. Well, it's not. What you're looking at there is a graph of human population growth over the, well, pretty much since civilization. And you notice that it's pretty flat, and I'll explain why in a minute, until we get to the 20th century, and then it shoots up like a rocket. And that vertical line where it shoots up, that's where you and I, every one of us was born. And that's why all this traffic and all this sprawl looks normal to us, because that's all we know. That's our baseline. Well, it's not. In fact, we are all part of the most abnormal population spurt of any species larger than microbes in the history of biology. But because it's our baseline, we don't see it. So, how did this happen? The two biggest reasons, even bigger than religion. I mean, first, that line that's pretty flat shows that, like every other species on the planet, through most of our history, pretty much we died as fast as we were being born. So things stayed fairly stable. But then at the end of the 18th century, right at the very end, the smallpox vaccine was invented. Smallpox used to knock us off by millions every year. Suddenly, fewer people were dying of that. And that was followed by all these medical advances in the 19th century. Pasteurization of milk, discovery of antiseptics, other vaccines. I mean, up until that point, average human life expectancy was 40. And you know, the majority of babies did not live to bear babies themselves. But suddenly infant mortality was way down and people were living a lot longer. And our population began to grow. We crept up past 1 billion, And then by the end of the 20th century, we were a little over 1.5 billion. But still, that's fairly, you know, that's a fairly acceptable population. I mean, and frankly, you know, there's nobody in this room, particularly those of us over 40, who have anything against medical advances. But then something else happened, which also at first seemed like a great idea, and that was advanced food production. In 1915, two German scientists discovered, one was called Haber and one was called Bosch, and they discovered the Haber-Bosch process, which is probably the most significant human invention in history, beats the wheel. It was a way of pulling nitrogen, which is an essential nutrient, which usually is contributed in the soil by a few nitrogen-fixing plants who have bacteria that can get it out of the atmosphere. They learned how to suck it out of the atmosphere and chemically apply it to the land. And suddenly we had an unlimited amount of that vital nutrient. To put it simply, if it weren't for artificial nitrogen fertilizer, over 40% of us would not be here. That's how significant it is. Of course, there are great downsides to nitrogen fertilizer. We all know, what it does as it leaches into our water system and ends up creating dead zones in the ocean. It's a contaminant that leaches soil. It's also, in its elaboration and then in its decay, one of the biggest sources of greenhouse gases that we have. When it decays, it turns into nitrous oxide, which after methane is our third worst greenhouse gas. And it takes a lot of fossil fuels to make the stuff. Well, it started being applied commercially after World War I, and our population rose above 2 billion in the 30s, and then it hit 3 billion in the 50s. And then suddenly people were populating so fast that not even the fertilizer could keep up. And in the 60s, there were dire warnings that the world was going to sink into terrible famine, particularly in Asia. There was a famous book, one of the icons of the environmental movement in 1968 called The Population Bomb, that warned that unless there was some kind of agricultural miracle, hundreds of millions were going to die. But lo and behold, at the same time, an agricultural miracle was in development. We call it today the Green Revolution. Careful selection of wheat and corn and later rice produce plants that, I'm oversimplifying a little bit, that had much shorter stalks so they could put more energy into producing much more grain. Now, these were laboratory-bred plants, so they didn't have all the natural defenses, and they needed a lot of chemical inputs just to protect them from, from weeds and from pests. And that combined with nitrogen fertilizer gave them a boost. And suddenly we had, well, Asia and it was saved from famine. The first application of Green Revolution crops, which were developed in laboratories in Mexico, they were sent to India and Pakistan, and famine was averted. And everyone, particularly economists, and even still today, you hear it constantly, the Green Revolution debunked Malthus and debunked Paul Ehrlich. He and his wife Anne wrote the Population Bomb because it showed that human ingenuity could create enough food to feed everybody. But someone who actually disagreed with that was the founder of the Green Revolution, Norman Borlaug. When he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize, he's credited with saving more human lives than anybody in history. He didn't congratulate himself for having ended world hunger. What he said was, we've bought some time. And unless we combine advanced food production with population control, that's the phrase that he used, we're going to have a tremendous problem. Because Borlaug understood the paradox of food. When you have more, fewer people die of famine. And when fewer people die of famine, they live to give birth to more people who also don't die of famine, et cetera, et cetera. So when I was researching this book, one of the places that I went to was India, which within this decade is going to surpass China as being the most populous nation on Earth. And it's also running out of water because they dug so many wells to water those Green Revolution crops. Wells that were originally 15 feet deep, and now they go 500 and 1,000 feet deep. And finally, farmers can't afford to keep digging. They can't afford to pump the electricity to pump that far. I spent a very unhappy day as a journalist interviewing the widows of Green Revolution farmers who finally gave up and committed suicide. And their favorite method of doing that is by drinking pesticide. In the last 20 years, 280,000 Green Revolution farmers in India have committed suicide. Pakistan is one of our fastest growing countries on earth, and it's also one of the scariest places I've ever been. There's 180 million people living in a country the size of Texas, which has 26 million people. And by the middle of the century, Pakistan will have more people than the United States has today, and it'll still be the size of Texas. And it can't possibly employ all these people. And so it's filled with all these frustrated, angry young men. And it's no secret why it is a nest of terrorism. Every day that I was there were grenade battles in the streets of Karachi, not just gun battles. I lost an interview with some environmentalists there who were saving the mangrove forests around Karachi Harbor because the day before they were found floating, tortured and floating in the harbor by someone who wanted to cut the mangroves and sell the wood. I mean, Pakistan's out of control, and it is a nuclear power. In fact, just one rogue Pakistani scientist was all it took for North Korea to become a nuclear power. So what are we supposed to do? Let people starve? Well, no, of course not. But today, nearly half of the non-frozen land surface on this planet is now devoted to feeding just one species, ours. And that's the main reason why we're pushing so many species off this planet. Now, just before I went to the Vatican for this book, for obvious reasons, the Pope had issued an encyclical that said that on this planet, there's enough to feed everyone if we just do a better job of sharing. But when I went there, I asked, by everyone, does the Holy Father just mean humans, or does he mean other species too? Because after all, I'm pretty sure that God made it quite clear to Noah in the Bible and also in the Quran that in order to save humanity, you got to save all the animals too. We cannot have a world without them. And the other problem that our presence is causing, of course, is carbon dioxide. You've probably all seen the famous hockey stick curve, of carbon dioxide contributions to the air. It's identical to that curve, and that's not a coincidence. I mean, right now, there are so many of us demanding energy because we're all addicted to it, no matter how poor. And although we have to keep doing everything we can to fight for renewable energy on this planet, there still isn't enough of them on a massive scale. So right now, there's more CO2 in the atmosphere than there have been in 3 million years. And there has been in 3 million years. And 3 million years ago, the seas were almost 100 feet higher. Compounding all of that is that the way we produce and transport food is one of the biggest energy users and CO2 producers of all. Look at it this way. When people ask me if I think that overpopulation is the biggest environmental problem, I reply with another question. I said, well, if there weren't so many people, would we have any environmental problems? Now, we may not have the technology yet for massive renewable energy, but fortunately, we do have the technology to limit the number of people demanding to use energy and CO2. And in my research, I found many culturally acceptable examples of voluntary, non-draconian ways of getting people to believe that it's in their best interest to use birth control. My favorite example in the book surprises a lot of people in the West because it's a Muslim country. In fact, one that has been included in the axis of evil. In 1979, Iran had its Islamic Revolution, and it was immediately attacked by Saddam Hussein. He figured it was very vulnerable because it was reorganizing, and he wanted to grab an oil-rich province on the border between Iran and Iraq. And at the time, Saddam Hussein and Iraq, they were allies of NATO, and we provided him with a lot of munitions, including the material to produce nerve gas. All Iran had was bodies, so the Ayatollah asked every fertile Iranian woman to do her patriotic duty and get pregnant to create a 20 million man army to fight off the invaders. And for 8 years, they held them to a standstill, and finally there was a truce. But at that point, the economist who was the head of budget, national budget, went to the Ayatollah and said, we got a problem, because all these kids that were born during this population explosion, I mean, at one point, they had the highest fertility rate in human history. He says, within 10, 15 years, they're going to grow up, they're going to want jobs, and we're not going to be able to provide them. And we're going to be full of frustrated, angry, they were going to be Pakistan, basically. So the Ayatollah understood, and he agreed, and then he died, and the new Ayatollah, one of his first acts was to issue a fatwa saying that there's nothing in the Quran that says if you have the number of children that you can take care of, there's nothing that says you can't have a vasectomy. And that was immediately stretched into any kind of birth control. And I interviewed a gynecologist, an obstetrician, a very devout Muslim woman in Tehran who told me what it was like to be part of these horseback brigades that went across to the most remote villages, bringing everything, every kind of birth control from condoms up to tubal ligations, and it was all free. The brilliance, though, of the Iranian plan was twofold. First of all, they didn't tell people how many children they had to have. They said, you can have as many children as you want. It's your decision. But they asked every young couple, I think ordered every young couple, to attend premarital classes before they got married. It's not a bad idea for anybody, actually. Quakers do it here. And you could either in a mosque or in a health center, and among other things in those classes, they learned how much does it cost to raise, feed, clothe, educate a child. And then, here's the other prong that was so brilliant. They encouraged every woman and every girl in Iran to go to school and to stay in school. Every country that I went to, rich country, poor country, every religion, Buddhist, Muslim, you name it, the best form of birth control turns out to be female education. Because when a girl is studying, she will postpone her pregnancies almost always until her studies are done. And then once they're done, she's got something really great to do with her education, remunerative, helpful for her family, but you can't do it without 7 kids. If you got 7 kids hanging on you. So throughout the world, every single culture, you get a woman through secondary school, and on the average, 2 children or fewer. Now, because it takes 2 people to make a child, if 2 people have 2 children, they replace themselves, and population does not grow. Any number fewer than that population shrinks. Iran today, 60% of university students are female, and Iran came down to that replacement rate a year faster than China did with its one-child policy. And time doesn't permit me to tell you some of the other really interesting examples, like in Buddhist Thailand or Catholic Mexico. But another great thing about this technology is it's varied and it's cheap. It would cost less to provide birth control for everyone in the world who wants to use it, and I include men because I talk about some of the new male contraceptives that are coming online, it would cost less per year to do that than what the United States has spent per month in Iraq and Afghanistan during this century. It's only about $8 billion. And if we did that universally, gradually, after 2 generations, the population would start to move to a more sustainable level. And that would give us time during that to adjust to a steady state economy, not one that's based on the impossibility of perpetual growth. And we can talk a little bit more about that in questions and answers if you want. One of the countries I went to for this book, for the economics chapter, Japan, which already has a shrinking population, is learning how to do that. And in that chapter, the other part of that chapter is set right here in Burlington, Vermont. I especially want to thank 2 visionary University of Vermont economists from the Gun Institute, John Erickson and Josh Farley, who helped me very much and who appear in that chapter. People sometimes ask me, well, is it really population? Isn't it really consumption? If we consume less, wouldn't that take care of the problem? And isn't the United States then by far, the worst perpetrator? Well, if you multiply consumption by population, then yeah, we're the most overpopulated country on earth. But the fact is, the 2 most consumed products on earth by far are consumed by everybody on earth, rich or poor: food and energy. And we're all addicted to them, and we cannot do without them. As one of Rachel's mentors when she was at Stanford, Paul Ehrlich, comments in my book, there's just no condom for consumption. What are we going to do? Do without food? But there are condoms for family planning. There's all these other choices. And when I was doing my research, I was very proud that the United States has been by far the biggest donor for international family planning programs. Although our current president, I don't have to finish that sentence, but let me put it this way. Right now, at the level of contraception that we have out there in the world, it's still too much. Half the countries on this earth are at replacement rate, but we still have a long way to go, and we're headed to 11 billion people. Oh, no, it's about 11.4. They keep pushing it up by the end of the century. If we cut back the access from the level that we have right now, just 1/2 child more per woman out there, we'll be headed to 16 billion people. But if we were to extend contraceptive choice to everyone who wants to use it, instead of 16 billion people by the end of the century, we would be down towards 6 billion people and well on our way to a sustainable population. And frankly, I don't think we're going to make it to 11 billion people. Every species that exceeds its carrying capacity suffers a population crash. And look at what's happening to our world right now. It's bursting at its seams. The wild weather that we have is now our new norm. But this is technology we already have, and it's affordable. And if we combine it with universal female education, think of that added bonus of all these educated females. This is a huge untapped resource in so many parts of the world who will help us not only be part of the producing economy, but help us bring this world down to a sensible size. Otherwise, nature's just going to do that for us. And frankly, when you see survival of the species on the National Geographic Channel, it's entertaining. When it happens to your own species, not so much. Well, I'll just tell you one little story from the book here, and then I'll open it to questions. people oftentimes say to me, yeah, but is that realistic? There's all these countries out there that, you know, they're never going to have birth control. They're not going to allow it to happen. Well, you know, the Vatican, the Vatican is this Catholic country that is, all due respect, I mean, I'm not Catholic, but one of my greatest mentors in life was a Catholic priest. But, you know, it's a country populated by, population of 1,000, and nearly all of them are gray-haired men. But it's surrounded by this other Catholic country called Italy that has, per capita, one of the highest rates of female education in the world, and it has one of the lowest birth rates in the world. And the story that I want to tell you from Countdown actually is from that scariest country, Pakistan. One night in 1995, 5 Karachi businessmen were out to dinner, and as usual, they were just whining about how crappy their country was, how everything was going down the tubes, how, you know, why even take your kid to school because the teacher never shows up except for the day that he gets paid. And by the end of that dinner, they decided, you know, instead of just moaning about this, let's do something about it. So they decided to start their own school system. It was going to be private, but it was going to charge symbolically, and they were going to open it in the poorest parts of the country, both rural and urban. And I went to the first school that they opened up. It's in a village right next to where those environmentalists were killed in that mangrove area. I mean, its name, Machar, means mosquito. That kind of says it all. And the only economy there is that when the shrimp boats come in every day, the church bells, or it's the muezzin called, the mosque, and everybody wakes up about 4 in the morning, and the kids who have the littlest fingers peel shrimp. So people have a lot of shrimp peelers. Well, they started a school there, and it's this beautiful, clean, simple but well-lighted place with ornamental plants. Kids go in, they go right to the bathroom where there's these antiseptic soap dispensers because their fingers have been cut up by the shrimp. 50% boys, 50% girls. They want it to be coeducational, so boys will grow up alongside girls and they'll learn to respect them. Because a lot of fathers won't send their daughters to a school with male teachers who might take advantage of them, all female teachers. And the school is just a delightful place. You would send your own kids there. And then there was a secondary school right next to it, which had labs and it had computers. And in middle school, every kid there is asked, what do you think you'd like to do with your education? And, you know, a lot of it's traditional roles. Boys want to be doctors, or they want to be engineers or pilots. Girls want to be doctors also, or nurses, teachers, flight attendants sometimes. Whatever they want to do, they find them a professional of their own gender, and they pair them with them. They have a mentor. And because it's a very conservative area, they can't ever talk about family planning. But these girls all see that their professional mentors only have 2 children maximum. And when I met with the director of the school, he said, and that's how we're changing Pakistan. And I said, man, that's great. I said, but, you know, what about the Taliban? I mean, the Taliban has said that they're going to blow up any schools that educates women, you know, and they shot poor Malala in the head. And he said, we don't have any problem with the Taliban. We took care of them right away. I said, how did you do that? My country can't take care of the Taliban. And he said, oh, it was simple. We just told them, for every one of our schools you blow up, we will open 5 more. Last year, they opened school number 1,400. If they can do it in Pakistan, we can do it anywhere in the world. Thank you very much.
So we have time for a few questions. I will bring the mic to anyone who has a question to ask.
So my question is that the United States has such a problem with throwing away so much food every year. And I know that France has been opening these like damaged produce markets and stuff, so they sell all their broken boxes or dented cans or, you know, bruised apples for less money so more people can afford to get decent food. Do you think that is possible in the United States, or do you think we could adopt something similar to that so we waste less?
Well, wasting less would be a really good idea. You know, in my own town, I live in a town in western Massachusetts, about 3.5 hours south of here. There are programs. We have a local food cooperative, and when stuff expires, it's distributed through food banks. And we try, you know, as best as we possibly can to make sure that waste is minimized. I mean, you know, that's a good question because it's just, there's so many things that we can do to be better at what we do. And all the food that isn't wasted means less land that has to be cleared to grow more food, less fertilizer that has to be used because they still use it. So, yeah, that's a good suggestion.
So I just wrote down the solutions that you mentioned to sort of solving this grand problem that we face.
I only mentioned one: educate women. It's the best thing I can think of to do for the environment, frankly.
Yeah, that was one of mine that I put down. I also put down technology, which sort of goes hand in hand with education, I would say, probably.
Yeah, you know, I'm not sure that I mentioned technology. I mean, yeah, so I guess
Well,
solar
solar
technology.
panels, yeah.
But just to understand the situation that we're in, to build a solar panel, to build a wind turbine requires inputs. You got to mine the metals, you got to transport them, you've got to fabricate them. That takes energy. And there was a pretty brilliant paper which I cite in Countdown, written by, well, I won't go into that, but two brilliant people who had interviewed previously, that calculates that solar arrays and wind turbines take 30 to 40 years to amortize out that carbon debt in their construction before we start getting real renewable energy. So
So can I take that one off?
no. We have to do it. I mean, yeah, invest in solar because ultimately, 40 years down the line, you would rather have solar panels than a coal plant.
Mm-hmm.
But there aren't too many technological silver bullets that we can think of.
Right. And I think I put this down self-control as well, like cutting consumption in ways of like cutting our addictions for things, but I think that could go with education as well. But what about like space travel?
Yeah, you know, I'm oftentimes asked if, you know, we can just start sending people off to other planets. I'm a sucker for space. I would love to go. That would be fun. But when you think, again, of the inputs, you know, the amount of fuel propellant, the rockets, the technology that we don't even have yet. There was a book of mine that was up there before, An Echo in My Blood. It's a history of a secret I found in my own family. It was from Ukraine. My family was Jewish. And during the Russian Revolution, the pogroms before the Russian Revolution, the richest man in the world, Baron von Hirsch, had foreclosed on a property called Argentina. And he decided to take all the Jews from Ukraine and ship them to Argentina and recreate the shtetls, you know, the fiddler on the roof thing in Argentina. And he started doing it, but just the bureaucracy, you know, everything that you have to deal with to move people like that. Argentina now has the biggest Jewish population in Latin America as a result, but the 125,000 Jews he physically moved out of there were quickly replaced by population growth, and that's what would happen if we tried to send everybody off in spaceships. Space, I mean, we don't even know, you know, outside of Tucson, Arizona, they tried to create basically space modules for how we would live on a planet. That was Biosphere 2, one of the most important experiments in history, because it failed. We could not replicate the ecosystem. There's so many variables. So how are we going to do it on Mars or the moon? But it doesn't mean we shouldn't try. It's a fun problem. More questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering, in Vermont here, we have a problem in rural areas with keeping populations sustainable. And I was wondering what you would say to people who are concerned with keeping rural communities strong. And if we were to implement strong reform to our population growth, would we have to then spread out the remaining population differently? And kind of how would that look practically?
Without being familiar with the program, I can't answer in detail, but I can tell you one of the things that I saw in Japan, which was really interesting, was, you know, Japan's population is shrinking because after World War II, they lost. And not a lot of people realize that Japan started World War II because they were overpopulated. They were growing their food in Manchuria and finally decided to go in and take Manchuria and make it part of Japan. And then they got greedy and they kept going, and then they lost. So their soldiers came home just the same way as ours did, and there was a baby boom. But Japan's economy was in tatters. Suddenly there were 10 million more Japanese, and people were starving to death. Pregnant women were throwing themselves in front of trains rather than watch another baby die of starvation. So in 1949, emergency measure, they legalized abortion, and that cut off the baby boom because millions of Japanese women partook. So now, as the last overgrown generation dies off, there's a much smaller generation, and that's why their population is dropping. But what is happening is that a lot of young people realize that as the population in rural Japan drops, there's property out there that's cheap and that they can live a nicer lifestyle, and they're moving out there because Tokyo's expensive. And industries, Japan has always built up its economy on export-based heavy industries and manufacturing. Those industries are now turning themselves around, and some of them are becoming very nimble, light industries, and they are following the young people out there. And we're starting to see a really nice dispersed population and economy happening in Japan, and it's much more livable. I interviewed a lot of these young people. I went to visit them, and it's just a nice lifestyle. So I hope that that might be a model that is going to work up here too. I live in a small town also, and we are concerned about not having enough people for critical mass, but we also live in a small town because we love not having too many people, you know.
So this has been fascinating. We probably have time for just one more question.
Okay, there's one out there in the corner.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you ever worry about your own health when you go to a place like Colombia, the right Gaviatos, or in 21 countries?
Do I worry about my own health?
Safety and health.
Yeah, well, you know, at the moment that I'm putting myself at risk, all I'm thinking is, wow, look what I'm getting to see. And then I end up worrying about it later. I mean, my book, he mentioned my book Gaviotas, which is set in Colombia, and there were two very dicey moments. I mean, in one of the moments, the moment that actually led me to write the book Gaviotas, I was traveling with a FARC guerrilla in the most fabulous, it's not just the most fabulous national park in Colombia, it's probably the most biodiverse spot on the planet. And it was being torn apart by guerrilla warfare and by coca growers who were moving in, which is why I was there. I mean, Colombia is this incredibly gifted country with 2 coastlines and more rivers than Africa, and amazing natural resources, and it was in literature and art and prosperity, and it was committing suicide, which to me, you know, this nature preserve that was being torn apart was a symbol of Colombia, and Colombia to me is a symbol of our planet. We live in this wonderful planet that has all these resources and all of these human resources, and we're making some unwise decisions. So anyhow, I was out there doing that one, and the army attacked, and a lot of the guerrillas that I was traveling with did not survive. I was lucky that I did. But at the moment when it was happening, all what was going through my mind was, my dad fought in World War II. He put his life at risk because it was the right thing to do. And I'm out here trying to cover the environment because, it's the right thing to be doing. Now, I was single at the time. It was a little easier. But that sounds very foolhardy now. And afterwards, when I got back to Bogota safe, I went, oh my God, was I crazy? The second time, while I was researching gaviotas, I was in a safe house with a bunch of widows and orphans because another guerrilla battle had opened up. And by then, I was with my future wife. And I was thinking, what the hell am I doing, risking my life for truth again here? And this was we were living together, but we weren't married. She wanted to. I had been married before. I didn't see that marriage really helped a relationship. But after I got out of that one intact and got back to Bogota again, I went and I bought a ring. I decided if I can risk my life for journalism, I can risk my life for love. And let's love our planet and let's do whatever it takes. Thank you very much.